All right, ready to go. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is a discussion on the single feed. So, I wanted to kick things off with just broadly and say, well, first I have to say, all of this is still subject to the antitrust policies that we reviewed in the last session, if you were here or if you saw earlier today. So keep that in mind. And there is a test later on that, yes, for sure. So that's for point number one. Point number two is, what we don't want to do today is really talk about the policy or the reasons behind it, or whether or not it's going to pass, that sort of thing. That's a lot of it going to be happening in the pain points discussion. So today what we really wanted to focus on was going to be the implementation and how do we actually get to a point here where a single feed becomes a reality. So my name is Joel Burzum. I'm with Zillow Group. I have a panel here of some esteemed folks to share their perspective, their insight on single feed, and I'll just let them introduce themselves quickly.
Yeah, thank you. I am the esteemed Tehran Tikan. I lead Zillow Group's Bridge Interactive Business Unit, and I serve very proudly on the board of directors for RESO.
Okay. Well, let's start the conversation really broadly, and I'm going to throw it to Tehran because he's closest. But what is a single feed? Maybe if you can just let us know, kind of in your mind, what's that all about?
Sure. So the concept of the single feed was sort of birthed out of conversations with RESO's broker group really a couple years ago, and getting feedback from brokers across the country that gaining access to data from MLSs was a little confusing sometimes and inefficient, causing brokers to need to get different data feeds, different logins to receive data under an IDX license, a VAL license, a broker back office license, etc. And so this single feed concept basically pulls all of those together so that brokers and their designees can access all of the data fields that they require in one data feed.
So, Cass, I'm going to throw it to you. Why is that necessary? Why do we need to do this?
Well, obviously, you don't need it. We've operated for decades without it. It's just, essentially, it's minimizing complexity. From a broker's point of view, access to data is really sort of a commodity issue. It's not where a broker sort of wants to kind of stick their head down and sort of use access to MLS as a responsibility. But it can be a very expensive utility, it can be very complicated, it can be a barrier to operate. So if a broker spans multiple markets, if a broker services company spans multiple markets, it becomes very complex quickly. Reducing that complexity, I think, would help
Sorry, I'm going to jump in here. Can you expand, because I thought for any of those that that were part of the CMLS conference, either in person or visibly, York from MoxieWorks had what I thought was the soundbite of the conference. So, can you go down there?
Yeah, I'm the source for that. So York was, I wouldn't say brilliant, but he was asking me about some data stuff. And he was sort of phrasing, how many feeds do you have? And I said, well, depends on how you define a feed. And so I think all of us here, the answer I gave him was, we have 4,000.
500 feeds. I'm not that idealistic, but I do think there's some room to reduce that significantly.
Yeah, I'm a little bit competitive, and so I took that question back to the data people at Zillow, and I asked them the same question. I was a little frustrated and also a little pleased that we did not beat MoxieWorks' record, but we deal with about 15 to 1,800 different data feeds, just pulling data in from multiple listing services. So it's there's definitely complexity.
I'm not sure anybody wants to win that contest.
And I think it's important to remember, we're talking about the services to your broker participants.
Yes.
These are participants in your MLS. They already have access to all of this information on the front end of your MLS system. So why are we making it harder for them to access it on the back end to do the business that they need to do in their back offices?
So, Teron, I'm going to go again with your closest.
And esteemed.
Maybe break down just conceptually how would a single feed in your mind work?
Well, we've only got an hour. No, it's actually there's been an elegant solution that RESO has been working on, and so conceptually speaking, what we have today, right, is use cases tied to a license, and conceptually speaking, the single feed contemplates attaching the use case to the data. All right, so a lot of questioning looks from the audience. So let me explain that. Very simple. Each MLS goes through each of the data fields in their database and attaches metadata to that field that categorizes the use case for that particular field. So I'll give you an example. This is work in progress. This is just conceptual in nature. Do not throw tomatoes if you disagree. But if you think of it in terms of three categorizations, right? Public, private, and confidential.
Yeah.
So metadata attached to the address field would be, have a public classification. So this is aligned to IDX. You can use this anywhere for public display. And then it gets more restrictive as you go down. And so something that is private would be akin to the data fields that are permissible for use under a VAL feed. And then confidential is something like broker back office, and then there can be more MLS only, so on and so forth. So the concept is really, really simple. And again, just to restate what I said earlier, it's attaching the use case to the data.
Cindy, Teron mentioned licensing.
Right.
How do you see licensing factors in this?
Right, so you're talking about one single data feed, but that might be for one license, that could be for 3 licenses, that could be for 5 different licenses. You're still licensing how the data is going to be used. Like I said, these are for MLS participants, so you already have agreements with them under your MLS participation agreement about what they can and cannot do with the data, but you also have data licensing agreements. And it'd be up to you as an MLS whether you want to have one single data license agreement that says, okay, here's the full data set, but here's what you can do with this data, here's what you can do with that data, or you can still have different agreements. So you could have one for broker back office feed. You can have a separate data license agreement for IDX and a separate data license agreement for VAL if that's how you choose to handle it. And that would be in the short term. That's something you can do tomorrow, is turn on that single data feed and have the different license agreement. What Teron is referencing for the metadata, that's kind of the dream end goal, right?
Yep.
Where they receive the metadata, and that would tell them in that this is how that data is going to be used. Because right now, if we give MoxieWorks, or a broker that's using MoxieWorks a full data feed, and we tell that broker, well, you can use this field for that, they're having to look at our MLS rules and the different data license agreements to figure out what can be used for what. So ideally, it would be in the metadata, but it doesn't change your data licensing agreement. You still have full flexibility on whether you want to do that as one single agreement outlining how they use it, or different license agreements for each use case.
Cass, what are some of the benefits behind this, particularly for the broker? Like, what do you see as, Why
Well-
would this make sense?
Well, I think it would make sense because, so I think if we were to step back and reinvent MLS feed distribution in 2021, we wouldn't do it the same way we do it now. I think, a lot of the multiple feed scenarios are a legacy of, the late 90s when IDX was first evolved. And so as a brokerage, as someone who has to who's being held to account by an MLS to make sure the data is accurate and make sure you're not violating the rules, it's more complicated when you're dealing with more feeds. If you can narrow down the number of feeds that you're dealing with, if you can narrow down the amount of data that you're having to store, if you're narrowing down the amount of images you have to store, it's easier to focus on compliance and the rules that matter. Now, what Tehran is talking about is great, because if RESO or somebody were to able to come out with a document or a metadata system that anyone could refer to and say, this is your template, this is the model that you're going to build your rules engine around, that would be wonderful. Because, as Cindy said, we've had to just sort of piece it together from reading through a bunch of data licenses over the years, and even now we miss things, and MLSs are not reluctant to remind us of that. And so, it makes us very nervous. Yeah, and the MLS has the power. They can just shut off the feed. So we try to address those as quickly as possible. But if you, with a single feed, you can then focus on the licensing, which is really probably the part of the equation that's most important.
So, sorry, I just want to add one other thing. Look, by and large, CAS and MoxieWorks have figured out the solution to the problem, right? They're up and running, and you conduct your business every day, and so does Zillow Group, and so does most of the people in the industry, right? But the other advantage to the concept of a single feed is exactly what you said. If we were going to design a system or a solution today, it probably wouldn't look like what we currently have, which means that there's also a benefit to new entrants in the marketplace.
Absolutely.
New entrants coming to the marketplace having an easier time dealing with data access and data licensing simply means more innovation for the industry and more competition, which we should all be applauding and hoping happens.
Absolutely.
What about you, Cindy? What are some of the benefits for the MLS in particular?
Well, yeah, I can immediately say, we have always provided a full data feed for our broker participants. We rely on that license agreement and that MLS participant agreement. And, if they step over the line and misuse the data, well, we can turn off their feed. We can also, have their association suspend their MLS services. We have all those agreements around that. But think about if we have to, and most of our brokers do not need this. The vast majority of ours are mom and pop shops. They're hiring a vendor, and that vendor is getting a specific IDX feed. But for a lot of our larger brokers, they do have multiple products that they use in office, that they develop products for their agents for. And so we give them that full data feed. But if we had to give them, 15 different data feeds for their CRM, and one for their IDX, and one for their VAL product, and one for their ABM product. So we've got all these, 5 or 6 feeds for this one broker, and that broker participant becomes inactive. So instead of turning off, one feed when they become inactive, we have to go in and find all those feeds they have and turn all of those off.
Yep.
So that in itself is a big advantage.
Yep.
Let's maybe fast forward a little bit, a couple of years. We've got a single feed in place. Like, what do we need to do in terms of implementation to make this actually possible? Yes.
Well, I think it can be incremental. I think Cindy's case is a perfect example. I mean, in essence, in North Texas, it already exists. And there are lots of MLSs where that's the case. We have a single feed. It provides data for multiple products. We have a rules engine on top of it that manages the data flow. But I think what we want to get to is something that's a little more metadata and systematized. But I do think that's going to take time, and I think there's probably some intermediate steps around just encouraging MLSs to change their licensing rules to allow for a single feed for multiple use cases. That's not really a technical implementation. That's just a process or a process or licensing change. And then from there, I mean, that would potentially be enough. You could then, MLSs could then provide an easy cheat sheet for here are the rules that you need to pay attention to. And then if step 3 down the road was an automated way to do that, that would be ideal.
First, how's everybody doing? We are extremely cognizant of the fact that we are the only thing standing between you and a break and then the cocktail party, and so that's never an enviable position to be in. But everybody good? Can you guys hear us in the back of the room? Yeah?
I thought there was going to be a bar in here. That was part of the deal.
Yeah, I thought that too.
Is that not? Okay.
Again, that goes back to not wanting to get hit by a tomato. First and foremost, this is very likely. Whatever, if this policy passes NAR in this November, no one is, at least I'm not contemplating that this is something that we flip a switch, the industry flips a switch and it is implemented immediately, and IDX and VAL and all that stuff goes away. So this is very much being contemplated as running in parallel to all your existing data feeds, right? And so I don't want anybody out there thinking that that anybody up here is advocating for a complete change in direction. And really, that's kind of it for me.
Well, and also I think it's likely that an MLS may have several different versions of feeds that they provide. I think what we're just talking about is, for the mom and pop shop, they just need an IDX feed. For maybe someone who does multiple products, they need something with the confidential data as well. But and I think the point is really it should be one feed per data consumer rather than multiple feeds for multiple products.
How does an organization like RESO need to think about standard?
Sorry. How does an organization like RESO need to think about payloads and standards and trying to figure that out? What do you think is necessary there?
Right, and RESO sometimes, this is a tech crowd, so they're sometimes way far ahead of the curve compared to the local MLS. The MLS is strapped by, what resources, staff-wise and technical resources they have to implement new policies. So that's why we have, governance structures that really slows things down. So anything that we have to decide on that can move the cheese a little slower than normal. But for a lot of the data implementation type things, data licensing, for the majority of MLSs, I don't think we necessarily go through a whole board of directors implementation and discussion. That's kind of, at least in our organization, we handle most of that on the staff side, and the board of directors gives us full ability to approve data licensing and things like that, and that is the ideal. I think wrapping your mind around the difficulty, because I know I got some questions from some MLSs on what the single data feed would mean, because you have to separate the technical feed of the data from the data licensing and the permissions. Yeah. And so again, whether you do that as one agreement or you do that as separate agreements, and I think the end goal with the metadata, the simplest thing I can equate that to is what many of us deal already with: documents, with your document management system and transactions. Most of those documents, we have an implementation in there where it's public-private MLS. And so that dictates who can see that. And so that's very similar to how the metadata would work in the payload. Like today, you have in the payload the IDX, what fields are mandatory for IDX payloads, what's optional for IDX payloads. And so we would just have a deeper dive into that, about this field can be used in these use cases and this field cannot be used in those use cases. So it will be a dive for the staff at MLSs to understand that and understand what's under the hood in that payload.
I want to address security, because that's obviously a big conversation when we talk about putting data feeds out there. So, Cass, what do you think is the implication to security here when you're putting all of that data into one field?
The reality is we already have the data. I mean, my nickname at MoxieWorks is lovingly Dr. No, because a product person will come up to me, every couple of weeks and say, "Hey, what if we did this with our data?" No, can't do it. And so the reality is, I think the original data license that we sign that has, very prescriptive language around what we can and can't do with the data is the biggest barrier to abuse. You know, I mean, we all know people, vendors have done things they should have done with data historically, and that's always going to be a risk. But the reality is, if, you know, I think what really prevents us from doing that is our interest in maintaining our reputation in the industry and our desire to be an ongoing concern into the future. I mean, you know, if we ruin our reputation, we're less likely to get data licenses in the future. Our customers aren't going to trust us. So that's really the main incentive. I understand that there, you know, that question may want like a more technical answer, like how would we implement it? But the reality is, I mean, there are hundreds of vendors out there and brokerages and out there right now with a lot of data that if they chose to, they could send it places that the data licenses do not allow.
Cindy, what about you?
Yeah, sure. That's certainly a concern. And a best example I can think of that is the agent email address.
Yeah.
Currently, right now, every participant and every agent in your system can look up an agent's email and contact that agent. We do not provide an easy means in the front end of the system for anybody to download all those email addresses and spam all of those agents. When you're talking about a data feed, you got to look at that too. Is that something you're going to allow to be released in that roster data? You know, those are discussions that need to be had. And if you do allow that, then you've got to have you know, those licensing rules in place about what you can and can't do with that information.
With great power comes great responsibility, right? When you really break it down, on the security side, I get it. I don't think that much changes. We're putting data in the hands of data recipients, along with a license that says here's what you can do and here's what you can't do, and we're depending on them to play by the rules. And as Cass pointed out, and Cindy is well positioned to take action if somebody steps out of bounds. I just don't see that dramatic a change.
Yeah.
What are some of the conversations that you think, let's start with you, Cindy, like you need to start having with your team at Interests about the single feed? Like what are is it legal, is it tech, like is it implementation? What are those conversations that you think an MLS needs to start having?
Well, I do know, I think there have been some privacy concerns brought up from some brokerages about what that's going to look like, the security and privacy issues around some of the data and how that's going to be controlled. So that's certainly an issue. But for us, we already provide that. For an MLS that doesn't have that in place, it's just sitting down and looking at that data. While it's not in the metadata right now, that is something you can do internally, is look and say, okay, these are the data feeds we're going to allow in that back office broker feed. Again, we do some restrictions on the roster data that's available in that full data feed, but they pretty much have access to almost all of the listing data.
Cass, what about you? What are some of the conversations with the product teams or with the tech teams on your side that you need to start having for the vendors?
The reality is, I think most of the people on the product team in brokerages and vendors like ours already assume we just have one feed. You know, our job is to try to make the, you know, sort of the data layer and the services layer handle all those problems. And so I think, you know, as Teron said, you know, we've handled a lot of it, or most. We'd like to think we've handled all of it, but I know there are some gaps in our implementation. But so I think from the vendor side, this is just a pure win in terms of, I think what it does is it Make it easier for all the major players in real estate. I also think it will, I guess, shore up sort of organized real estate's reputation as being overly complicated and hard to get into. And I think there's some value in that too.
Cindy, why should?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a path that we have been on for several years at our organization is try to simplify things and review our workflow processes so that we can manage those data feeds better, faster, and the fewer you have to manage, the easier that becomes. And again, there's always improvements that we can do when we look at our, just because it's the way we always have done it, doesn't mean that's the best way to do it.
For me, fostering innovation. Right? Let's make things streamlined and efficient and as easy as possible.